Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning or good evening, depending on the part of the world you're in. Welcome, ladies, gentlemen, colleagues, and friends, and thank you for coming. And a very special thank you to our panelists for attending and all those who've helped to advertise, promote, and raise awareness of the event in any capacity. The title of today's event is Black Earth Scientists, Careers, Barriers, and Expectations. My name is Cassius Morrison. I'm a PhD research student in vertebrate paleontology at University College London and the Natural History Museum, as well as being a member of the UCL Earth Science Minority Ethnic Network. Now, before we start, there'll be a few pieces of housekeeping. Number one, the event will be recorded, so I'll just put that out there to make sure everyone's aware of that. Secondly, questions, please feel free to put them in the chat, or you may ask them verbally later on during the Q&A session. Thirdly, panelists and audience, feel free to put your cameras on, otherwise you can keep them off, whatever you feel comfortable with. And fourthly, for all non-speakers, please can you go on mute? We're not talking to minimize any background noise. Thank you. Now, the background for the event. Now, for Black History Month, we wanted to celebrate past and present Black Earth scientists and their contribution to geoscience. However, even as late as last week, in the article I have put in the chat already, and the title was Black Scientists Say UK Research is Institutionally Racist. Now, the article featured heavily Dr. Jasmine Scarlett, a student in volcanology. For those who do not know that, it's a subset of geology or earth sciences, and it featured prominently. Now, I will quote from the article. Dr. Jasmine has been excited to embark on a career in academic research. She believes she was well placed to get a job offers, given she had a distinction in her master's and is a recipient of the prestigious President's Medal from the Royal Geological Society. So she's very well qualified. However, the article goes on to say, I feel almost paranoid that it is because of the color of my skin, because the feedback I consistently get has been, your CV is great, you are great in the interview, but there's someone that's got that little bit extra, and those people have been white. Yet how different is this from the historical situation? Now, intentionally or not, many Black Earth scientists and other ethnic minorities are often erased or forgotten from history. A few examples, and things are changing more recently because people are looking into this. A few examples is, for example, John Edmund Stone, who was a former slave who taught Darwin taxidermy, preserving the specimens used to formulate the theory of evolution. How essential was that in terms of the theory of evolution? We have Marguerite Williams, the first Black American to get a PhD in geology in 1942. Her thesis on the factors of erosion in the Anacostia River, little work had previously been done on the basin, and deducing that in addition to the natural erosion, human activities, including deforestation, agriculture, and urbanization, accelerated the process. Now, how relevant is that in today's climate changes going on? And there's also Graham Quartzey, apologies, an 18th century natural history scientist, a former slave, who along with many others are often overlooked in the great early days of collecting and natural sciences. Yet, without such individuals, how far would the field have grown? Here are just a few of the historical examples, and there will be a couple of articles coming out later exploring the contributions of some of our very esteemed colleagues, contemporary colleagues. Now, diversity does have many benefits. For example, there's a variety of different perspectives, increased creativity, higher innovation, faster problem solving, better decision making, increased profits, higher employee engagement, and a reduced employee turnover. Now, there has been a wide range of research, and even though the figures may vary depending on the study, the Harvard Business School has a good article, and I have put this in the chat already, that shows the heterogeneity of decision making can hinder the growth and finances of the company, whereas when you have diversity, it can increase growth and save money, and it's better for the company overall. Now, for earth scientists and geologists out there, a good analogy would be The resilience of the ecosystem to survive and adapt to change is far greater when there's greater biodiversity. During climatic change, a low biodiversity can result in the collapse of the whole ecosystem. Thus, there is strength, resilience, and growth in diversity. And even though there are many benefits, most importantly, it is morally the right thing to do. Now, I hope this is the first event in a series of events and discussions exploring how to increase diversity, equality, and inclusion, not just across different ethnic minorities within geosciences, but also across the other protected characteristics within geosciences. Now, for those who do not know, a protected characteristic is one that it is against the law to discriminate against. And here are some examples, but they're not limited to ethnicity, age, gender, neurodiversity, sexual orientation, physical ability, and religious beliefs, as well as intersectionality. And this is the analytical framework for understanding how aspects of a person's social and political identities combine to create different modes of discrimination and privileges. So, for example, a Black lady may be discriminated against for both being a Black and also being a woman. Now, even though there are many specific issues for different protected characteristics, ultimately we all want the same thing: respect and a lack of discrimination that everyone has a right to. Now, just to give a brief outline of today's event, each of our esteemed speakers will speak for about 5 minutes on the subject of Black Earth scientists, careers, barriers, and expectations. Then we will have a panel discussion, and the question being discussed today is, do we as a community expect minorities, in this case Black scientists, to behave more ethically than others? And is that fair or reasonable? And for this, audience members may put questions in the chat, or they may ask them verbally at the end or during the Q&A session. We will then round up with a Q&A session and a summary. Now, let me introduce the speakers in the order that they will appear. We have Ben Otto, a PhD researcher in paleontology from the Chicago University. We have Cameron Muskelly, a paleontologist and science communicator. We have Dr. Brendan Kilburn, an independent postdoctoral researcher from Germany. We have Dr. Lisa White, an assistant director of education and outreach at the UC Museum of Paleontology. And we also have Dr. Sudanese Basul-Gupta, a senior research associate from University College London. And even though this is a whole topic in and of itself, she'll be discussing the intersectionality to do with the underrepresentation of minority ethnic women in geoscience. So I will be handing over to Ben. So Ben, if you'd like to start.
Sure. Thanks for the lovely introduction, Cassie. And thanks for having us all here. Good to see so many people. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, good. You know, my headset's been a bit knackered from a year and a half of Zoom meetings, so kind of it's falling apart a bit. But yeah, so kind of obviously a lot of interesting ideas, and kind of I was coming to this one thing I was thinking about is sort of kind of the expectations that we internalize and how sort of on the one hand, we think and talk about these issues being, systemic, institutional, outside of individuals who generally aren't going out of their way to be harmful by and large. And, a lot of whom are, actively trying to do good things, have good intentions. But on the flip side, kind of within ourselves and to a certain extent the environment around us, there's sort of like really hyper individualized focus where it's like, oh God, well, like I'm here and so many people aren't. So, in addition to overworking because, you've already gotten here with the internal expectation, either trained through experience other people telling you, often your parents, that, you have to do more than the expectation, more than what's reasonable. Pretty much every time, even if nobody asks you, especially nobody asks you, because, it's you and you're there, you have to prove that you can run the race, walk the talk, talk the talk, walk the walk. There we go. Talk the walk would be kind of hard. And so you end up kind of holding yourself to like this really high standard of achievement on the one hand, but also kind of this like, in a sense, kind of like a moral standard too. Like, okay, I had like 3 meetings today and I got talk scheduled, and this is this. All right, I'm eating lunch, and yet racism still exists. Oh God, this is my fault, which, reasonably, intellectually doesn't make sense. But, there's kind of this feeling that, you have like an additional incumbent kind of moral duty to solve these problems because, you've been chosen, well, so many people have not. And so it ends up being this kind of, source of frisson, which isn't necessarily anybody's fault, and it's not, categorically awful, but it ends up being very draining, certainly personally. And kind of externally, you end up kind of feeling implicitly, sometimes explicitly, that you're sort of invested with this kind of moral duty, because you're part of this category, which is assumed to be kind of, definite and defined and kind of intrinsic, and with this kind of moral weight, because you're part of a minoritized group, pick one, so you suffered, trademark, when you have the clear eyes to cut through the privilege and the bullshit, dispense truth and either bless things as good or condemn things as bad, and kind of even or especially when people have good intentions, they kind of want that from you, or you feel like they do. So you're not so much you, the individual, anymore. You're kind of this representative agglomeration seraph, be not afraid, you go up to heaven, you go down to hell, you're not a racist, you are, condemn this and that. And again, nobody kind of like tells you to do that, but that's often how it feels. And it's very weird and kind of like operationally, I don't think it's terribly helpful, because again, it moves kind of the side of the problem from, how is the institution structured, how is the machine built, what's it built to do, to who operates the machine, and kind of institutional systemic problems that propagate without really anybody involved constantly thinking about them. And indeed, that's why a lot of people constantly thinking about them, trying to solve them, to this is a demographic problem and we can solve that by changing demographics. That's part of it, but I think the key is to work on structural solutions such that even if the absolute number of, say, like Black geoscientists was the same now as at time one, the system overall would be better, such that they would be having a much better time, and there could conceivably be more, because at any given time you're just taking a snapshot of how many people are doing anything at any given time, and kind of have it kind of depending on them being there to kind of provide a, I don't know, sort of brief skeleton accretion, sort of forcing the issue, for lack of a better word, it's going to get you some of the distance, and it's important, don't get me wrong, but it's not going to get you all the way there, because you still have to bring them in, retain them in the first place, and then you're back to all the issues why there aren't so many of them in the first place. So that's my opening sermon.
Thanks a lot, Ben, for that for those very useful insights. Over to you, Cameron.
All right, thank you so much for the introduction, Cassius. So the thing that I kind of wanted to harp on a little bit is opportunities within geosciences, especially for people who are African-American or other ethnic groups. Not only am I an African-American but I'm also on the autism spectrum. And so we both have to, these types of groups both have to fight in order to get their place into geosciences. And so when I was growing up, I didn't really have that many opportunities within geology or within paleontology. I was living, I grew up in a single mother household. And so it was hard for us to try to figure out what opportunities were out there. For me, as a person who was curious to really get interested in geology and figure out where I wanted to go and start on with my life. So I think that the biggest thing for us, as we see a lot of young people who are really interested about the natural world, who are very, very curious about the natural world, but don't have that many opportunities growing up to try to get their hands and to try to learn what they can learn. I spent a lot of time in libraries. I had to pretty much build a lot of things on my own. You know, I don't have a PhD or a master's degree or a bachelor's degree. I am completely self-taught. So I pretty much had to try to figure out my way in the paleontology because I didn't have the opportunities that a lot of people did have when they got into this field. And this field is very interesting to me, but trying to get inside of that field without having the proper tools at hand, such as a degree at most, or, you know, having the opportunities to get myself into the field was pretty much very harmful for me as growing up. And I also dealt with a lot of racism towards my, when I was younger, as I was the only African-American kid at school that I knew of who was really interested in paleontology and was really interested in geology. Though you had a lot of teachers who supported that interest, there were a lot of students that didn't. And so I've gotten some pretty flack from people of color and then people who are also non of color telling me, you know, there aren't any Black paleontologists out there. You're never going to be a paleontologist because Black people don't become scientists. You know, they personally have never heard of what a Black scientist looks like or what a Black scientist is. And they've also never heard people of scientists who have disabilities. So because they didn't hear it, it's going to push them saying, oh, just because I didn't hear this, that probably means you can't do it because I never heard of a Black scientist. I never heard of a scientist with disabilities. So it's important for us that we represent what a scientist looks like. When I'm out doing public outreach, I often get, you know, I tell people, you know, I study fossils, I'm a paleontologist, and you kind of get this response back from the younger generation as well as adults that come across on when I'm doing outreach is, oh, you're a scientist. I didn't know what a scientist was, or, you know, I didn't know that you could become a scientist. And that's because, you know, there aren't a lot of African Americans, there aren't a lot of people around the ethnic background who have this representation of scientists. And so opportunities is such a big thing for people of color. And I just recently began to carve out a niche into the field of paleontology and geology. And having those opportunities in place for other people is extremely important. I'm a big advocate of that. I support people who want to be into the sciences but don't have a lot of people at hand here. So I think that's kind of what I want to harp on, and I'll pass it off to the next person.
Thanks a lot, Cameron. It's been very insightful, and I think it does highlight the need for opportunities. And it just more credit to you for all the hard work you've done, and maybe you've got to. Brendan, if I hand it over to you.
Okay. Thanks, Cassius, for the invitation and for the introduction. So my background is that I come from a household where I was encouraged to be curious about the natural world at a very young age. But when it came time to choose a career, my parents were really dead set against me going to academia. They were more concerned about me making money and having a very upper middle class sort of lifestyle. And so that came down to a lot of my professors from university, from college days up through graduate school, really being supportive and really sort of being mentors. And so, you know, my essence to capture there is that those mentors were not Black people. And, you know, you can get in situations where people mean well, but they don't really know how to express things properly. And so I can think of one mentor who would say things like, well, getting a job in academia is very competitive and it's very hard, but you're Black and there's not so many of you in the field, so you have an advantage to get a job over other people, which you can see how problematic it is to say that, but it's very oddly meant in a constructive way. So you have to deal with that. And then, I've also had experiences where outright hostile racism. Like during my training, sitting in a seminar where the instructor says, okay, we're gonna have a surprise topic today, race and intelligence. And Black people are not as smart as white people. And they're going on for 90 minutes about this topic. So, there's a question. So, in these situations, think, okay, well, mentoring is key. And regardless of, I think ideally having people that look like you and having people that sort of represent a broad diversity is ideal, right? So you can just see sort of the proof in front of you. But for whatever reason, if that is not there, I think it has to come eventually, but say for the short term it's not there, then you need to have people who know how to talk about these issues. And then when people misbehave, you have to hold them accountable, right? And I think this is really key. So yes, there's institutional problems. Yes, there's institutional bad behavior and discrimination, but also this issue of individual bad behavior, like how do you hold people accountable and how do you create really a safe space, or say a space that really promotes everyone equally in the department in terms of encouraging them, making them feel welcome, making them feel engaged and valued in the department, I think is really key. As to whether I feel, say, a personal or ethical responsibility, for me, that comes from my own experience and kind of, being treated, to put it politely, not so well, and not wanting someone else to go through that, right? And so that's kind of where the impetus falls on my shoulders to try to bring change. So I guess it's just, trying to, in some ways, what I've gone through, make sure someone else hasn't gone through. And I'm trying to think of what else I can say. That's the thing. There's always this kind of, in some ways you're kind of, I guess, you're kind of singled out in a way when you're the minority. And again, to give you another example of well-meaning thoughts or interactions, but are just kind of going off the rails, like being in professional society and being the only Black person there at the meeting. And then someone comes up to you and says, oh, well, can you tell us how to get more Black people to join society? And it's like, well, I'm not the ambassador of all Black people. These are these are bigger questions, right? I can't give you that solution. And so it's, I guess, I see a lot of, at times, well-intentioned behavior, but it's very clear that people in these sort of leadership roles, these more mentoring roles, maybe there's more like society committee roles, don't really know how to approach these topics that's in a way constructive and just appropriate. I think.
Thanks a lot, Brendan.
Huh?
Oh, sorry.
No, just to say, just as a person of color, it's not necessarily fair that this burden falls on your shoulders to try to somehow correct this. But at the same time, given your experience and you don't want the next person to deal with this, it does kind of fall on your shoulders, if that makes sense.
Thanks a lot, Brendan, and apologies for jumping in too early. And thanks for providing those very useful insights, as well as sort of the challenges in trying to address this issue. Dr. Lisa, over to you now. Thanks.
Great. Well, thank you, Cassius, for inviting me to be part of the panel. And I'm just really inspired by all the stories of others. And what I'd most like to share is the importance of taking the long road to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and really making broader impacts, sharing science part of the work that we do as our scientists. And so I'll share a few stories that has me always just thinking about the times we're in now, where everyone, is trying to promote greater inclusion equitability in science and access. And there are many of us, and I'm sure many of us on this panel, who've been working on these issues, prioritizing them really our whole science and professional lives. And I do come from both an activist family and an academic family. So my parents met at San Francisco State University in the 1950s. And my father later went on to obtain a PhD in psychology at a time when there were very few Black psychologists. And one of his first faculty positions was at San Francisco State during a year when the university went on strike. In 1968-69, the students, mostly the Black and brown students that were first generation to college, demanded that the curriculum and academic programs reflect their own life experiences. And so he, as a professor, as he was appointed Dean of Undergraduate Studies, was really supporting them. He had helped to define Black psychology, the field of Black psychology, in his own work. But I bring up that example because even as a kid, I saw the importance of really supporting the need for change and the role of activism, particularly among students, in initiating change. Now, I'm from a family that includes 3 girls, so I have 2 older sisters, and they're totally outgoing, so is my father, my mother as well. And so I was more the quiet, shy sibling who was, just happy playing outside and poking around in museums. So I grew up near the California Academy of Sciences in San Francisco. And so I really had an unusual path to geoscience because even though I grew up in an academic family, I really didn't have that much exposure to that particular science. But I love museums and found a connection to science that way. So fast forwarding, when I did finally realize that's what I wanted to major in, I found that I was constantly having to explain what it is that geologists do, what paleontologists study, why the work is important, why I didn't want to major in another science or become a doctor, which is sort of the usual thing we hear, in communities where the expectation is you'll study a field that has a relatable job. And so I think that planted the seed of the need to really explain what it is that we do and how important the work is. And when I finished my graduate degree at University of California at Santa Cruz, I went to a faculty position at San Francisco State University, so I guess following somewhat in the family footsteps. But before I came to Berkeley in 2012, my current role at Berkeley is I'm the Director of Education Outreach. But for 20 years, I was a faculty member at San Francisco State University in the Department of Geosciences. And really from the beginning of my faculty career, I was initiating programs with schools in the San Francisco Bay Area, taking pre-college youth out on field trips, just trying to make those connections again, to earth science and to paleontology. And I really heard the range of things from why do you want to make that part of your portfolio when you really should be focusing on your classroom teaching, your research, or I would hear the other side of the expectations, which is, oh, well, you're a woman of color, we need you to assume those roles. So you take on all of that, all the educational partnerships, all of the work with students who don't have easy access to education. So I felt like I was always straddling those expectations, but what I really was after was just being true to myself and, wanting to promote our discipline. It's a great field and there's lots of opportunities. So I just kept doing the work, and, in some years, just putting my head down, ignoring people who were constantly asking, why are you spending so much time on informal science or these partnerships that may not count for anything, when you come up for promotion and tenure. But, it turns out they do, and they especially matter now. And so I'm experiencing the other end of the spectrum, which is, departments and museums and universities scrambling to find people, that are willing to lead programs that champion diversity and equity and inclusion. And people are really ill-equipped, to make really genuine partnerships and collaborations because they're starting so far behind or don't have genuine intent. And so whether as a Black professional, I've felt pressured to do that kind of work, or I've done it because I think it's part of, a well-rounded professional career, I think in the end, it is really important for us to have opportunities to lead in those areas because it does help, reduce the stereotypes of just what we're capable of, how we communicate, the kinds of leadership opportunities that, we can elevate when we can, show others all of the potential for our contributions when we're led to feel, more welcome to choose in the directions that we want to emphasize. So thanks for the opportunity to chat, and just wanted to share that.
Thanks a lot, Lisa. Thanks for that insight, both of hope and of how change occurs. Dr. Sudanisa, would you like to go next?
Hi, Cassius. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Is it okay if I share a few slides very quickly? So thank you very much for organizing this. And I'm going to just cover very quickly a focus on gender, race, intersectionality to understand minority ethnic women underrepresentation in geoscience. This is a project being supported by Global Engagement Fund, UCL, and it's in collaboration with colleagues from the department, Andy and Isabel Hopp, who is a student. I'll show some quick slides, some quick results. The project is ongoing, and the plots have been prepared very carefully by Isabel. And we are looking into it and comparing it with Australia. And we think we are almost in the same position in terms of how much inclusivity we have been able to induce into our field. But I think we are UK slightly better placed in terms of data related to ethnicity. So Caroline Tiddy from UNISA Australia, and we have other collaborators from Royal Holloway, Anirban, and Christina from University of Glasgow. So just looking at this one, what we tried to look at the data on undergraduate UG entrance starting from 14-15, going all the way to 19-20. If we look at the blue bars, that's the female students in geoscience. There has been an increase, more or less a steady increase. We are at about 42% at the moment. But if you compare it with the BEM representation, that's the orange bars, it doesn't follow the same trend. And even that the marginal improvement that you see for the total BEM students as undergraduate UG entrance, if you follow the gray bar, that's the female students, female BEM students, we do not see it at all. So there has been no progress that has been made. Now, when I use BEM, I mean Black and Asian and students from minority ethnicity. We acknowledge that by using this identifier, we are homogenizing diversity in a way for this different ethnic groups. But at the moment, we are sticking to this. Now, if we look at the progression in earth sciences from undergraduate to postgraduate thought or postgraduate research, what you see on the left-hand panel, that's the orange bars, that's for the female students overall from undergraduate, postgraduate thought, and postgraduate research. It's nice to see that overall for the female students, we have made some progress, and that progress we were able to sustain for the PGT and the PGR. Whereas if you look for the BEM female students, the picture is very dismal. We haven't made much progress when it comes to the UG level. So what we are trying to target is the representation. What would be ideal is the representation should reflect our British population of BEM students. We are far, far from that. And even worse is that what you see in UG is not sustainable at all in the PGT and the PGR levels. So we are way, way behind. And the other thing that we noted here, and we are looking into more data to come to a conclusion, to make an inference, the 1920, the BEM female students going for the PGR studies have even dropped. So whether it's a pandemic effect that has affected BEM females particularly, it has affected everyone, but it could be even more, it could be reflected in the BEM female students much more than others. We have to look into that. So any improvement that we made was not sustainable. Well, 16, 17, we did see a larger intake of PGR students, BEM students, but it was simply not sustainable. Whereas for the female students, any upward trend overall was maintained. We also are looking into the data and comparing it in terms of looking at it in terms of different universities. There is something to be happy about in the sense that the Russell Group universities, example, UCL, obviously I've been trying to look at UCL a little bit more closely, and Imperial College, they tend to do better than the national average for UG courses when it comes to BEM female intake. There is a general trend of improvement from 2014 to 15. And at the UG level, we are getting closer to the British population. But this trend, again, is not being continued in the PGT and PGR courses. So what we see is the leaky pipeline problem for BEM females start much earlier. We know that there is a female underrepresentation in the academic positions for females overall. But when it comes to the BEM females, that underrepresentation, that leaky pipeline starts way ahead. So breaking the circuit, these are my thoughts because Cassius said that we can share some of the personal reflections. So I've taken the liberty, this is outside the project at the moment, to share a little bit with you. Some of it is a reflection of what the other panel members have just said. So there has been some discussion. So what I think is we need to break the circuit. This low intake, the leaky pipeline, and the lack of role models will obviously translate into low intake because there's no one like us to see. How do we break it? Relatable outreach activities. Lisa is an expert. Lisa has been talking about it. So yes, I would emphasize on the word relatable, something people can connect to across the economic spectrum, across cultures, energy transition, climate change, water scarcity, natural hazards, like application-based, something where they see that if we get into geoscience, because there is a cultural aspect of it, they can think about an employment that will make a direct, that will make some difference that is understandable right from the start. And liberating the curriculum, I think UCL is putting a lot of energy into it. Collaborating beyond West, diversifying the guest speakers in the modules. I do that very carefully for my modules, and I'm encouraged to do it as well, so which is a good thing. Using global case studies, again, that makes what we study more relatable. And attracting diverse talent, thinking beyond Oxford, for me, it looks like a propagation of systematic error. We know the underrepresentation in Oxford. And then if there is an emphasis on the universities you come from, rather than your activities, rather than your research output, rather than your teaching output, that's going to have obviously translate across the whole system because there is a lot of reliance on the references you bring, the universities you've been associated with. And if the starting point is where there is underrepresentation, there would be no improvement made unless we can break that. And widening networking and informal mentoring opportunities, that is where I feel that BEM geoscientists are kind of disadvantaged because that informal networking doesn't come. And with that information about strategic plans for career progression, that's where they are left behind. And diversifying recruitment criteria and panel, which UCL IC is doing, I think is doing making some advances, making some progress. The impact we have to see. I mean, it's not going to be immediate. Well, hopefully it'll come through. Ring fencing opportunities, it's a very controversial thing, but it's something that might be considered. And in all these efforts, it's nice to have platforms to voice one's thoughts. So that's really nice, but, and I enjoy that. I've been in UCL for a long time. I've been here from 2009 to 2011, and then again from 2013. And I work across two departments, Department of Earth Sciences as a senior research associate, and as a lecturer teaching in chemical engineering. So there has been a lot of improvement, a lot of platforms where we can talk, where we can discuss. This is a big advancement. Nevertheless, I would think, so that we don't get on doing tick box exercises, we should set SMART goals. So that we can monitor the impacts and short-term and long-term. So that's all I have to say on my slides, and I can take any questions later. Thank you.
No, thanks a lot for that very insightful research, and clearly there's a lot of data there. And if anyone has any questions, I'm sure you can ask them either later on or offline. But it just shows you the amount of work that does need to be done, but also how trends do vary. But firstly, thank you for all the speakers. I now would like to open up the panel discussion. And the question being discussed is, do we as a community expect minorities, in this case Black scientists, to behave more ethically than others, and is that fair or reasonable? I.e., are they held to higher and different standards? If any audience members have any points or questions, please type it in the chat or feel free to ask it at the end. But Cameron, I'll come over to you because you were talking a lot about opportunities. What are your thoughts on that question?
I think, wow. Yeah, I haven't, yeah, it's a really big question to answer. Yeah, there are like many different standards that a lot of earth scientists, that a lot of people hold earth scientists to, how to behave, how to dress, how to act. When I was first out doing public outreach and things like that and doing research, you have this constant pressure on African Americans specifically to dress the way you're supposed to dress, you know, make sure that you look like a professional in a particular kind of field. And I think that's it's a good stigma. And then there's also a bad stigma to it, that we as African Americans have to pretty much act like professional scientists just because we are African Americans. And I think that's a bad stigma, and that's also a good stigma. But I think that, yes, I think earth scientists, or African American and people of color earth scientists, do tend to have this, or put on this higher pedestal of saying that this is what we need to look at, this is what we need to dress, or however, or talk, in order for people who aren't people of color to take us seriously and things like that. I hear a lot from this constant, because I live down here in the South, and so it's very much different. And I hear the way where I'm talking to other people about communicating science. I get this, oh, you're very articulate, you can talk very well, as if African American men and women aren't articulate and don't really speak in that way. And I guess it's just how people are raised in the environment. But you get this constant struggle of, you know, this is what a scientist is. This is how you need to act as a scientist. And I get this all the time, and I hear this a lot from other different people. But yes, absolutely, there is this stigma of this is what a Black scientist needs to do in order to be taken seriously in the field. And I think that's there's a small portion of there's a good portion of that's good, and then there's a bad portion of that as well.
No, thanks, Cameron. Brendan, I'll bring you in because you were talking about this sort of expectations during your sort of speech earlier. Do you have anything to add to that, or anything you think, you know, could highlight, you know, the good, the bad, or the potential there, or, you know, what needs to be addressed? And then I appreciate it's a big question.
Yeah, I mean, I guess to sort of follow up on what Cam was saying, I do think there is an expectation there, sort of more professional behavior, more professional appearance at times. But I think this is a larger reflection of society. I do think, particularly U.S. society, there is a bigger expectation about the professional environment, how, whether that's academia or not, how you're supposed to dress, how your hair is supposed to look, how, there's all these sort of expectations put upon you to sort of fit in to what the decided norm is. And of course, it's not your norm, it's imposed upon you what this norm is. And yeah, so that creates a very awkward experience, right? A kind of surreal experience. And, I think going through academia, you have to get, as a minority, I think not just a Black minority, but any kind of minority, you have to get a very tough skin and just in some ways kind of get tunnel vision and focus and try to power through. Now that's not, I'm not saying that's what you should do, that's the healthy thing, but I think that's kind of what the reaction is. And I mean, there is a quote by James Baldwin that I'm going to paraphrase, but it's basically, be Black and conscious in America is in a constant state of rage. And I mean, I think that also is true for academia, for the experience that I've had personally, because I got from my mentors, so Cam mentioned the comment about being articulate and well-spoken. I got from my mentors once that I have a speech impediment and will get a job because of it. That basically I can't speak perfect English. So, this almost in a way kind of performing, to this sort of ideal standard that's imposed upon you. Yeah, I mean, I find it burdensome, but I think the only way to sort of rectify this is by having a more diverse body of people in the decision-making powers and decision-making bodies, and also, in sort of these leadership roles. And really sort of these sort of engagement roles as well, really interacting with the public, really showing, hey, as a Black person, you do have other opportunities, you can be a scientist, you can be a historian or whatever, in academia. And so I think this is really key to show this diversity and kind of show the world that, all these opportunities, they're open to us and we deserve as much access to them as everyone else. So I guess I'll stop rambling a bit and turn it back to you.
No, thanks, Brendan. I think you do touch on a number of very sort of real points that many people can relate to. So Lisa or Ben, is there anything you want to sort of expand upon or bring to the table? Because I know you're both at different stages of your career, and at least I know you've seen sort of more changes over time. Is there anything that you feel things are improving, things are changing? Sort of change over time, as it were.
Right. Well, certainly support what the other panelists have said in terms of the expectations that are constantly there about how to behave, how to look, how to make yourself, part of the community of geoscientists that have set the standard that didn't expect, people like us, folks from different backgrounds, to be part of this community. Where I think there are some opportunities and some positive trends is the community of geoscientists, professional world, has certainly made it known now that they need help, in attracting more diverse voices and individuals from different backgrounds to the profession. And so clearly, they're in need of folks like us who can share our experiences, who can lead programs. And, as Sadesha, as you were saying, I mean, if we can't fundamentally change the way that we're teaching and learning, and I love your example of just liberating the curriculum, who says we have to continue teaching the same ways as we have in the past? And why can't we be leading now with topics that have very important relevance, especially to our communities, whether it's the impact of geological hazards, or climate change or water quality. And so I've found myself increasingly now, making those kinds of learning materials connected to those topics a priority. For not that I'm trying to satisfy, what the masses want or what, frankly, white geoscientists think that we should be working on, but because I've always been motivated by those topics anyway. And so if we're at this time where, folks are trying to increase the levels of diversity in our profession, then, taking advantage of that and opportunities to lead with topics that are personal interests to me, certainly. So,
Thanks for that, Lisa. And it's also the ideas of how it can be expanded. That's actually very insightful, very useful, especially with climate changes occurring now and how many people around the world will be affected in different ways. So, Disha, if I was just to bring you in, how do you feel? Has there been any feedback from your research that even the undergraduates or the postgraduates feel that there is a different expectation for them being an ethnic minority?
Okay, so this is a survey we wish to carry out, but obviously this is sensitive because of the low number of students from ethnic minority and disclosure issues. But this is something we would like to address. But I don't have anything to report back right now, but definitely we would like to see what makes them leave or stay right from the UG level and upward. So.
Thanks for that. I do know that there was a talk about there was a very good film about women in STEM, and they were talking about the leaky pipe and many of the problems that they faced as well. So I think there are different protected characteristics which have a leaky pipe and they face much discrimination. Ben, is there anything you would like to add or your experiences as a as a PhD research student? And
yeah, definitely. I remember when I was going to do my master's at Cambridge, of course, the family was like, you tell a family of Ghanaians that you're going to Cambridge, and the people were like jumping over the moon. No, but I was like, make sure you've buttoned down, white shirts and this, all this kind of professional office wear. And because that's the environment that, he worked in and, everything. And I was like, that's not how we do it. I spend a lot of time sitting in the office typing, handling rocks basically, or in cold warehouses pulling out drawers of rocks, and being in a white button shirt especially just doesn't make operational sense. Also coming from a high school where it's very British Portugal style uniforms, the whole bit. I was minimize that as much as possible. But yeah, it is still kind of this, coming from kind of internally found experiences, but also outside, make sure your hair is combed, this, that, and the third. Even when you kind of look around, it's well, I don't have to do this, but I'm doing it anyway because I can't stop doing it because, there's what's back in my head that says, when I stop doing it, that's when the whole facade will come crashing down. And I think, again, it's not kind of so explicit, but I think sometimes there's this sense on the flip side that all of this stuff is completely alien to you, and that insofar as you kind of fit into it, it's completely artificial and it must be so strange. Not to put a fine point on it, but this is just how I talk. I'm not kind of trying to sound white on the phone, for lack of a better word. This is just how my voice comes out. Obviously, there's a bit of variance, not everybody talks the same way in every situation, but when people say oh, you're so articulate, it's well, were you expecting something different? But also the sense that I'm not putting this on for you. I can just do this because this is how I, as an individual, am. Maybe you did not expect like an archetypical Black person to act this way, but you're engaging with me, and there's a human thing standing in front of you, and I can understand kind of the positive and negative desire to kind of like expand from like the single person to like a big archetype. But if you want like Black experiences and Black perspectives, you need Black people plural. You can't just go to this person and sort of decompose them into this big representative. And I think kind of like the tension between these kinds of things is interesting, but it's also kind of aggravating to various degrees. Yeah.
Thanks, Ben. I think you do touch on a very important point about sort of unconscious bias and sort of perceptions and prejudice that people will have even if you don't act in a certain way. I think a comment that's come up a lot is, oh, you are articulate. And I think that is such a loaded statement and a very insightful in terms of what people perceive. Before going back to any of the panelists, I was wondering if any of the audience had any questions or comments they would like to make. You can either type them in the chat or you can come off mute, as it were. Well, if anyone does want to, please feel free to type. I am very conscious of time, and we were supposed to finish at 6 o'clock, so I will try to keep to that deadline. So firstly, I would like to thank all our panelists and all those who helped to make this event possible. I think we've touched on a lot of insightful points, and it does show, the breadth in terms of unconscious bias, prejudice, what's been predetermined, the need for opportunity, the need for diversity, the benefit diversity will have. But I think also what's key is people aren't asking for special treatment. They're just asking for respect and dignity, and that everyone deserves. So going forward, we will plan future events, and information on those will be going out. But if anyone does want to get involved, either from an ethnic minority background or from another special characteristic, please feel free to get in touch. And I would like to thank everyone for coming, and especially the panelists. And thank you, and enjoy the rest of your evening, or day, or morning, depending on what part of the world you're on. And thanks again for coming, and everything is much appreciated. Just double checking if, there is one question I think we do have time for. Okay, so there is a question, and we do have, I know it's a big question, but there is a question here. How do panelists feel we can limit discrimination against minority ethnic people prior to entering into universities? So if anyone does need to jump off at 6 o'clock, we will be finishing on time, but I will keep it open to answer this question, as it were. So if any of the panelists would like to add any thoughts or comments to that, to this question that was asked. Or do I need to pick on someone? I guess I'm gonna have to pick on someone. Cameron or Ben? I give. Oh, Sudanisa.
Yes, just to take that question, my thought would be the supporting statement, the supporting letter when we deal with admissions. We do focus on that, but at the moment, I think we look at specific things related to work experience. For example, if we're looking for geoscientists, I would say I do it for chemical engineering. I'm sure they would follow the same thing for geoscience. The specific work experience that we look at related to the subject they are coming into, and that makes every sense. But at the same time, we do not consider the opportunities that individuals might have received. At the end of the day, a work experience or skills in another work experience can be easily transferred to a different field. I think those are the things that should be taken into account, because otherwise it limits people from marginalized people, not necessarily them students, but even students from economically disadvantaged background, the opportunities that they get. So I think the supporting statement and also the references that they come up with. Obviously, if they come from privileged schools, yeah, the references would be stronger. Or even for the postgraduate students, the references they get from their professors, wherever they did their UG studies, they have a strong reflection when we make the selection. Yes, so we need to open up, basically. Yeah.
Thanks for that. I think those are very insightful points, and hopefully we can explore them more in future, because I think you touched on a number of points in terms of both intersectionality and also opportunities, advantages, transferable skills, and sort of the need to evolve and adapt. So it is now good evening, it's 6:01. So I would like to thank everyone for coming, and hopefully I will see you again in the future. Thanks for coming, and have a good evening now, as it is now in the evening in the UK. So thanks a lot, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks.
Thank
Bye.
you for having me.